one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. God bless America.
Welcome back to the channel, everyone, where we love talking about movies and more. I'm your host, Mason Phillips. Today we got a movie review over Alex Garland's Civil War. Just saw this movie this past week, so now let's talk about the plot. In a dystopian future America, a team of military-embedded journalists race against time to reach Washington, D.C. before rebel factions descend upon the White House. I really enjoyed this movie. I think so far out of any of the movies I've seen this year, this has got to be my favorite. A lot of great movies have already come out this year, so that's telling you a lot about what I thought about this film. I think it hit you so hard. It's not an easy watch. A lot of hard, gripping content in this. And I think you might be expecting to go into this movie seeing one thing and you're going to be given another. The trailers definitely sold this movie on more of a wartime epic, and that's really not what this movie's about. You're following journalists going through this, documenting the war rather than participating in the war. It's not really about what the war is overall. Yes, there's a civil war that has broken out across the United States, but we don't even know what the reasoning for why the civil war has happened, what each side is trying to fight for. It's not really about why we're fighting the war, just the fact that there is a war happening and how you perceive the war happening around you. It's more about documenting the war versus participating in the war. You're seeing this from a journalistic perspective. So our main character, Lee, who is played by Kirsten Dunst, she's trying to take the most neutral stance here, not trying to play one side or the other, really just trying to be an informative journalist documenting what she is experiencing as she's going through the story. You see that this is not anything she hasn't been through before. She's been to other nations that have gone through things like this, but now it's something that's been brought to her home turf, something that she's having to deal with within her own country, within her own nation, something that she always hoped would never come to the U.S. and it's now finally, it's here, and now she's experiencing it for herself. Again, this movie, it may not be exactly what you were expecting going into. I can see why a lot of people wouldn't like this film and why it's a little polarizing right now, and it's actually kind of fitting. The movie itself is a civil war. There's a split even with the audience over this movie, and so maybe the movie did its job in doing that. Maybe it didn't. I can't tell you how to feel with this film. I can't tell you whether you're right to like it, whether you're right to not like it. I know the trailers were not very clear on what kind of movie you were getting here, but I was gripped. I was gripped from the journey. This is oddly a road trip type of film. We're going from New York City, traveling to Washington, D.C., because our journalists are wanting to get one solid interview with the president before D.C. is attacked by the opposing forces. This movie, it's not an easy movie to talk about because of the content that we're dealing with here, but it also does a good job at not getting overly political as far as conservative and liberal values. We don't know the politics of either side that is fighting in this war. We're not supposed to see it through that lens. We don't even really know the full politics of the president. So that's not really what this movie's about. It's about documenting what these characters are experiencing. It's not what I initially wanted or expected. Thankfully, I did some reading up before I went and saw this movie, so my expectations were tempered. I knew exactly what kind of movie I was going to be going into, and so I want to give you that heads up too. It's not really about the war itself. It's about people documenting it, experiencing it. It's about the regular person seeing all of this going down around them. You're coming at it from the perspective of a journalist. You're coming at it from the perspective of, I'd say, the everyman, not necessarily somebody who's fighting in this war. We'll see the conflict happen as we go through this journey. It's not shying away from the war itself, but the war is mainly a backdrop backdrop to everything else that's happening in this movie. We have some interesting characters here. Kirsten Dunst is our lead photographer, our seasoned war photographer. We have Joel, he's our writer. He's on a mission to get one final quote from the president, who supposedly hasn't given an interview to the United States in over 14 months. No one has heard from him in a very long time, over a year. And so they're on a mission to go and finally get this last interview, this last piece before he possibly meets his final fate. And then we have Sammy, who is our seasoned reporter. We're also accompanied by Jessie. She's the up-and-coming young reporter trying to make her name, trying to get her step in the door. And she's a character that at first I thought I would be annoyed with, but I don't think I ever really was. They handled her portrayal very well. And then Nick Offerman, the President of the United States. He is a background antagonist, so don't expect him to have a huge presence. He does have a presence in this, but as far as him being physically on screen, he only has maybe 5 minutes worth of screen time, if that. His character looms very large over the film, but he's not really a character that pops up on screen a whole lot. We don't know when this movie takes place. It likely takes place maybe 30 years in the future. It's a very near future type film. And so whether or not this movie's trying to warn us against going into a war like this, it is giving you the horror of the war, but it's also showing you how callous people can be in a war like this. And I think that speaks to what kind of world they're living in now. It's not really a good versus evil story because it's very muddled as far as who's good and who's bad. Are the forces that are going in trying to win this war, are they actually doing it for the right reasons? We don't know anybody's politics here, and so we don't know if at the end of the day the ones that win were the ones that we should have been rooting for. We actually end up seeing multiple aspects, multiple sides to this war, and whether or not one of them was better than the other, we really don't know. And at the end of the day, probably not. They may have all been flawed in their thinking, flawed in why they were fighting for what they were fighting for. There's really not a clear stance that the movie takes, other than the president is probably not the best guy. Yes, he's a very antagonistic type of character, but is this the solution? Was Civil War the right reaction to everything? And so, yes, it has some messaging it wants to tell you, but I think it did a good job in not pushing politics in this movie. So I got to give the movie credit for that, for not pushing one side or the other. It's not Democrat versus Republican, independent, whatever. It's not any of that. The war is simply a background to everything else that's happening in this film, pushing the plot forward. What else did I like about this movie? I love the sound of this movie. There are moments where the sound is simply just taken out of the room. You're hearing a few clicks of a camera here and there, and then when it gets into the battle, all it is gunfire and the soldiers talking back and forth to one another. When the movie wants you to feel the specific tone, the sound was a character on its own. Such a good job at capturing the feel and the tone of what was happening in each scene, and I have to appreciate that. I thought the sound of this movie was really good. One of my favorite parts about this movie specifically. The music in this movie I also thought was quite good. Each part of the soundtrack I thought was very fitting to each scene we were going into. I think it really helped to capture the tone of the film overall and the direction. I have to give Alex Garland credit here. I thought this movie was directed really well. Directed beautifully, and it's a movie that has very hard subject matter. This is something that could be easily polarizing, and it is easily polarizing. Overall, there's a lot of differing opinions on this movie, but I thought it was directed beautifully. I was gripped from beginning to end with this movie. I had a great time with this movie in theaters. Yes, it was a hard-hitting film. It's definitely one that sits with you for a while, and it's one that I'm still thinking about, trying to dissect. Even though there's a lot of vagueness around the external aspects of this film, it's really trying to capture and report on war. And so how do our characters react? Each one reacts to this in a very different way, and I thought that was captured very well. I thought all the actors did an amazing job. I was bought in with each and every performance, and I have to give each actor credit for that. I've rambled on enough about what I liked about this movie. Let's get into the mix section of this movie. So what I think was mixed about this movie? Well, I think it's what the movie's trying to sell you on, or what the trailers were selling you on versus what the movie itself actually is. I think there's a competing tone here with what the movie was being sold as versus what the movie actually is. So if you could do some research before you go in and see this movie, this is one of those where that's going to be very important before you go into this. I'm glad you're watching my review, so hopefully you get an idea what kind of movie you're going into here. If you set your expectations properly, you're really going to like it, but if you have expectations for a certain type of movie you're wanting to get or expecting to get, and then the movie comes at it with something else entirely different, that's where I think you might not like this movie so well, because you were expecting one thing and got something else entirely. That is a flaw and a knock I have to give on the marketing team for this movie. I don't think they sold this movie for what it was supposed to be, what it actually was. Another part of it is we were hyping it up to be one thing, thinking of it to be one thing, theorizing this movie to be one thing, and it turned out to be something else. However, what it did actually turn out to be, what it actually was, I thought was very good, very well told, and for me, it really worked. It just might not for you. So competing tones in what the movie is supposed to be versus what the movie actually was. I think that's the most mixed thing about this film, and there was one thing, I thought there was one song choice that didn't work out too well. It was so bombastic when we got into it. I don't think it fit the tone of the scene at all. I think it was really contradictory to everything that we were watching. I can't really go into specifics here. It's about right before we get into the second act. I think you'll know it when you see it. It was very jarring for me, but that's the most mixed thing I can give about it, is the competing tones of the marketing and what the movie actually is, and that one song choice that I just didn't care for. So now let's get into the negatives. Let's get into the bad aspect of this movie. I did want a clear understanding of what was happening in this Civil War. I would have liked to have known more about what each side was fighting for. What were they fighting over? I want to know exactly what they were fighting over. Is it just because they don't like this specific president, or is it more than that? Is it because of some of the policies he's implemented, or is it more than that? They're really vague on why this war is happening. That works in one sense. I would have liked to have just gotten a little bit more context. I think a little more context would have served this movie very well, but I also appreciated the vagueness of it. So I think this is something that could have been touched upon a little bit more. I think it needed a little bit more work, but that's really just a nitpick of mine. It's not really a huge knock, a huge negative against this movie. Overall, I really enjoyed this movie. So let's go over my final thoughts on Civil War. I really enjoyed this movie. I was gripped from start to finish. Thought most of the music choices landed really well. I thought the sound of this movie was outstanding. It really captured the tone of each scene quite well. The actors did an amazing job, and I think Alex Garland directed and wrote a really, really good movie. One that makes you think, one that sits with you, and one that you're going to be thinking about and dissecting later as you get out of the movie, whether you like it or not. But that is a really good mark for this film. I think it works out in this film's favor. With that, let me know what you thought of Civil War down in the comments section below. Would love to hear your thoughts. Remember to be respectful down in the comment section, both towards me and your fellow YouTubers. Let's give this movie a quick ranking. If I'm going to give this movie a ranking, it's got to be a 4.5 out of 5 or an A- on the letter scale. I really like this movie, and I really recommend that you go see it, but remember, temper your expectations. Don't go into it thinking this is a huge war epic. We're going to be following one side versus another. It's not what this movie's about. It's about what the journalists are capturing. It's about how they capture this war that's going on around them, how they report on this war that is going on around them. And we come at it through that perspective, through the perspective of the everyman versus the perspective of the military forces. So remember to temper your expectations, and if you do, I think you're really going to enjoy this movie. Remember to like this video, hit that subscribe button so you don't miss a single thing from this channel, and hit that bell icon so you get notified when new videos go up. I hope you all have an awesome and a fantastic day, and I'll see you in the next video.